They were joined by an author, a speaker, and a music teacher who made a major medical discovery in the field of visual neuroplasticity and now advocates for people who have cerebral or critical visual impairments. It's Stephanie Duesing. Hi, Stephanie. Welcome to the show.
Hi, it's so great to be here, Lee. Thank you so much for having me on as a guest on your show. And thanks for the lovely introduction. Yes, I am the author of Eyeless Mind, a memoir about seeing and being seen, which is the true story of how I, an ordinary music teacher, made a major medical discovery in the field of visual neuroplasticity, as you kindly said. And I am an advocate for all people who have cerebral/cortical visual impairment, or CVI, which was identified as the #1 cause of visual impairment in the developed world more than 10 years ago, and still doesn't have a diagnostic code. So I'm very, very grateful to be here today to help raise awareness about this common and frequently debilitating disability. We CVI moms call CVI the common disability that no one's ever heard of. And so I'm really glad to be here to help change that. I think CVI should be common knowledge in every household. So thank you. I'm great. It's great to be here.
No problem. Before we get into all that, though, can you just let everyone know quickly where you was born and where you grew up?
Yeah, for sure. So I grew up all over the place. I'm in the United States, and I was born in Idaho Falls, in Idaho. And we moved about every 2 years when I was young. So I bounced around across the country. I think my formative childhood, I would say, was in California, both in the San Jose area and then in a little town called Morgan Hill, which is not far from Gilroy, which is the garlic capital of the world, where they have Garlic Fest every year. So I'm spicy. And we settled in Illinois when I was in about 5th grade. So I'm still here in Illinois in the western suburbs of Chicago.
In the introduction, you're a music teacher. Why did you get into teaching and why music?
Well, I have always been a singer my whole life. I've just always sung, and I created my own songs just growing casually as a child. You know, I just was always singing. And it was just a natural fit. I found my people, my friends through choir in middle school and high school. And it was just a no-brainer for me that music is where I wanted to be. And I just love the relationship that you develop as a teacher with your students. And it's just an amazing thing. And so I actually taught middle school music for 10 years. I did the general music for 7th graders, and then I did 7th and 8th grade chorus, which I absolutely loved. And then I took some time off when my son was born, and then later I started teaching the kindergarten. It was first the kindergarten choir, and then it became the K-2 choir at my church. And then I became an early childhood music and movement specialist, and I taught Music Garden, which is a beautiful Montessori-based music and movement program it's just beautiful. And I did that out of my home. So I was teaching 7 classes of infant, toddler, and preschool music classes out of my home, and also running a voice studio. So it's just my life. I've just always loved music.
Well, so as we was talking off camera, I teach teenagers. I don't think I could teach toddlers.
I will be honest with you. Oh my goodness, when I switched into teaching the kindergarten choir, it took me 2 solid years before I calmed down. Those are so busy. They are so, but once I adapted to that, I loved it. Absolutely loved it. Yeah.
So you said as well you made a major medical discovery. What was that discovery and how did it come about?
That's a great question. Thank you for asking. So my son Sebastian is the only person in the world known to process his vision verbally, which means that he sees with words like a bat sees with sound. Sebastian spent 6 hours in the fMRI for the Laboratory for Visual Neuroplasticity at the Shepard's Eye Research Institute, which is part of Harvard, I believe. And Dr. Lotfi Marabet, who is the director of the Laboratory for Visual Neuroplasticity, captured Sebastian's use of verbal mediation to process his vision in the fMRI. And he published a paper on it in the journal Neurobiologia in collaboration with Dr. Barry Cran, who is the head of optometrics at the New England Eye Low Vision Clinic at the Perkins School for the Blind. So in January of 2017, we discovered that my straight A honor student, genius artist, and water polo playing son, Sebastian, was almost completely blind, and no one knew, not even Sebastian himself. And we were just devastated. We were just about to enroll him in driver's ed, and I was terrified for his safety, overwhelmed with guilt at not knowing that my own son was blind, and just devastated. I have no words for how devastating this was. And it all started in January of 2017. And we happened to be sitting on the sofa together. And I'm one of those moms that made a baby book for my son, and I'm not super crafty. And I spent a lot of money on the craft supplies to make all this baby book because I was going to document his entire childhood in, fancy, fabulous form. And I managed to make it through one baby book, and I never did another thing. So we had literally not looked at these pictures in years. I hadn't touched them, and so Sebastian and I were sitting on the sofa looking at his old baby photos for the first time in forever. And I was narrating to him who was in the pictures because it had been so long, and there's our families all over the place. So there was a lot of pictures of him with people that he wouldn't necessarily remember. So I was saying things like, oh, look, there you are with your cousins from Canada that we haven't seen for 7 years. And oh, look, there you are with our neighbors from the house we used to live in, back when you were a baby that you haven't seen since you were a baby. So I was narrating, explaining who was in the pictures for about half an hour, and we had migrated up from the baby pictures into the toddler and then preschool years. And my son, who is an only child, had been looking at pictures of his own face now for half an hour, and a really cute picture of him popped up on the screen, about 3 years old. It was just absolutely adorable. And I said, oh, look, who's that? And there were crickets. And finally, he just says, how should I know? And every time I tell this story, the hair on my back just stands up because I'm like, you've been looking, I just was like, it's you. How could you not know who that is? And he said, well, if you say so. And then I was like, this is not right, because my son is a very gifted artist who draws and paints faces and everything else that interests him with almost photographic realism when he wants to. We had no idea he had any disability of any kind. And in 2017, I had never heard of face blindness. I had never heard of prosopagnosia, which is the medical term for face blindness. I didn't know about CVI. I had never heard of cerebral/cortical visual impairment, none of it. And so I was just astounded because I didn't even know it was possible for a human being to be face blind. I didn't know it was possible for a human being to not be able to recognize other human faces. So I was astonished. I wasn't scared though. I was more curious. And so I was like, okay, well, this is very odd. And it was close to bedtime. So everybody went off to bed, and then except for me, and I'm on my phone, like Googling madly, like this, and it took me. Back in 2017, there was very little information about CVI that I could find on the internet. And so I took a while, several hours, and finally I found the magic combination of words about facial recognition problems, and I found it, prosopagnosia. Oh, face blindness, this is a real thing. And what I learned was incorrect. What I learned in 2017 was that supposedly it was very, very rare. Well, we know now that actually prosopagnosia is actually a common symptom of a common but poorly understood visual impairment. In fact, there was recently an article in the New York Times where they admitted that prosopagnosia or face blindness happens to about 1 in 30 people. So it's super common. But in 2017, while I was doing this research on my phone, I was told that it was very, very rare. So I was like, okay, he has a very rare quirk, but no big deal, right? Okay, so he's fine.
Sorry to interrupt. With face, so are people aware there is a face, but they can't link who the face belongs to? Or
so
I'm just trying to understand what face blindness is, because I've not heard of face blindness before.
Sure, and I'm sure a lot of people haven't.
Yeah.
So that's a great question. I know several people who have face blindness now, and they describe it basically, faces make no sense to them. They can look at a face, but there's no memory is recorded of what the face looks like. They often look distorted to them. They can't see the entire face. They might be able to focus on an eye, but not see anything else, or the mouth.
Okay.
anything else. And there's no memory, there's no visual memory that is stamped in the brain of what a person's face looks like. So every time they see someone, it doesn't matter how many times they see them, they never become familiar looking. And so people who have face blindness rely on other characteristics to identify people. And what my son had been doing was using verbal characteristics to identify people and objects and everything around him. And back in 2017, before I had cataract surgery, I used to always wear glasses. So my characteristics were tall, blonde glasses. And so when my son literally, when he thinks the words tall, blonde glasses, he gets a momentary glimpse of what I look like. And they actually captured that in the fMRI for the Laboratory for Visual Neuroplasticity. So he literally sees with words. He uses the descriptions of how we describe what things look like to be able to get a glimpse of what things actually look like, even though he's almost completely blind. So that was the first night of our voyage into CVI land, right? So that was a great question. And so to continue, what I want to say is the very next day, our world just turned upside down, because the very next day after we discovered my son was face blind, that was the day we discovered that my son had taught himself to count his steps and turns as a toddler and had been navigating our own home, our tiny neighborhood, and his extremely architecturally complex high school and all his other schools that way all his life with no one the wiser. And still the hair stands up on my arms every time I tell the story, because that's when I knew that his life, he was not safe. And we had always just considered ourselves to be the very, very lucky parents of a very gifted child. And he was expecting to go off to college. And all of a sudden, I didn't know if my son could ever live independently. Overnight, he can't go off to college like this. He's been literally following us around, following his friends at school until he figures out the pattern, and it's not safe for him to go off onto a college campus in a busy city location. He was planning to go to Chicago for school, right? And he's blind. We discovered he's blind. So on top of the prosopagnosia or the facial recognition, there's another condition, another symptom of CVI, which is called topographical agnosia. And that is the inability to recognize your surroundings. And so what happens is people who have topographical agnosia, no matter how many times they walk into a room or visit a place, nothing ever looks familiar because there's no visual memory being formed of what they're seeing. And so my son has lived in our home his entire life, and he knows exactly how many steps it takes to go up the stairs and down the hall to his bedroom, but he can't picture his bedroom. He can't picture where the stairs are in relationship to his bedroom. None of it. People who are typically sighted can form mental images of their surroundings. They can make mental maps. Well, people who have topographical agnosia have no ability to make a mental map because they have no visual memories formed of what they're seeing in their surroundings. And so this is also a symptom, can be a symptom of CVI. My son also has something called object agnosia, which is the inability to recognize objects. All of these things happen in different areas of the brain. And so for your listeners today, I want to talk a little bit about what CVI is. CVI is a brain-based vision impairment. It's entirely different from ocular blindness, and it's also more common. So what happens is when the light comes through the eye and lands at the back of the eye, it's transformed into an electrical signal that is passed along the optic nerve through the lateral geniculate nuclei, or the LGN, and it goes to the back of the brain. I recently, this past summer, listened to a lecture with Dr. Arvind Chandna and Dr. Gordon Dutton. And Dr. Chandna was talking about how they have measured the time it takes between when the light first lands in the eye and it travels that electrical signal to the back of the brain. It takes 1/10 of a second for that light to go all the way to the back of the brain as an electrical signal before there is any conscious perception of sight. So what that means is we literally see with our brains. Our eyes don't see anything by themselves. They are light collectors, and they are light transmitters. They transmit it into an electrical signal, but all of our conscious perception of seeing happens in the brain. And there are literally people alive today on planet Earth who have no eyes, who can see. Human beings don't even need eyes to see. And I will talk briefly about Daniel Kish. Daniel Kish was born, he lost both eyes to cancer in infancy, and he taught himself to echolocate like a bat. And so Daniel has no eyes, but he can ride a bike. Daniel has no eyes, but he can read if the letters are three-dimensional. When they put Daniel in the fMRI, they saw that his visual cortex lights up when he hears echoes, but not when he hears ordinary sounds. So he is literally seeing with echoes, just like my son sees with words. So there's different ways of visual processing. So the reason I talk about that is because it's important to understand that all of our visual processing is happening in the brain. So once that signal travels from the eyes through the optic nerve to the back of the brain, that's when vision begins. And so the back of the brain is where like motion perception starts. And then there's two different streams of visual processing. There's the dorsal stream and the ventral stream. The dorsal stream starts at the back of the brain and travels up across the top of the head, like the dorsal stream, the dorsal fin of a shark, right? And that's where like sorting out like people who have dorsal stream impairment often have difficulty or an impossibility in crowded environments. Finding a face in a crowd is impossible or very challenging for a person with dorsal stream impairment. Things like looking at the children's book, Where's Waldo? I don't know if you're familiar with that.
Yeah, it's called Where's Wally in England.
Yes. Yeah, and you have to find the little guy in the really busy scene, right? That can be so painful. It's actually painful for people who have dorsal stream impairment to even look at that. It's such a jumble of a mess that they cannot sort out visually. Then there's also the ventral stream. So the ventral stream goes from the back of the brain through the center of the brain. And the ventral stream is where visual memory happens, the ability to recognize faces. So if you're listening today and you take your right hand and you touch above your and behind your right ear, that's where the right fusiform gyrus of your brain is. And that's where facial recognition takes place. And so very close by to that is where your ability to recognize environments happens. And so when people have face blindness, when they have damage to the right fusiform gyrus of the brain, they very often also have topographic agnosia too, because they're processed so close together. If one is damaged, the other one also often is. And then of course, you know, the ability to recognize objects, biological forms. So my son literally can't recognize biological forms. He has no ability to recognize his own hands, face, or body. And so those are all processed in different parts of the brain. And so every person who has CVI has different symptoms depending on where the brain damage happens. It's pretty random. And so I think that's part of the reason why it's been difficult to get a diagnostic code, because every person who has it, when you talk to them, Dr. Gordon Dutton always says, if you've met one person with CVI, you have met one person with CVI. Unique.
Going to like things with the danger and all that, would it change someone's safety sort of if you moved your furniture around your house and stuff like that? So because they've mapped out in their head how many steps it is like to the sofa, and then you need to turn and stuff to get to the door, if you was to then move the sofa, would that completely change?
Oh yeah, absolutely. However, I do want to talk very, very briefly about something. Part of the reason that my son escaped all attention as far as anybody noticing that he was almost—
That's what I was about to ask in a minute, because obviously growing up, you would have moved stuff around and stuff, so.
Yeah, so there's two reasons. There's a lot of reasons no one caught that my son was blind. First of all, CVI can be an entirely invisible disability, okay? And that means there's no way to tell. If you met my son, you could not tell socially, academically, or physically that there's anything wrong with him at all, that he has any disability whatsoever, because the parts of his brain that recognize words, letters, numbers, and simple shapes, those parts are undamaged. So my son has visual access to numeracy and literacy, and he has normal acuity. And I will put a link to this couple of articles for you to put in your show notes, but it is actually common for people who have CVI to have normal acuity, like my son does. My blind son passed every vision test every year because our optometric exams are just decades out of date. They just are. Once I understand.
Letters on a wall, isn't it? So if you can recognize letters, you can see in their eyes, you can see, can't you?
Yes, exactly. So if you look at the eye chart and you can read the E, then your vision's fine. And there's no accounting for everything else. And I want to be very clear that my son, besides not being able to see faces, places, objects, biological forms, imagine like there's nothing in the world that ever looks familiar to you except words and letters and numbers and simple shapes. So my son actually taught himself to read and write at the age of 2.5. Wow. And he was reading and understanding the old Nancy Drew stories that I remember struggling with as a second, third grader, because they had all that lawyerly language in there. They're not an easy read. They're not dumbed down. And so he was reading and understanding that as a 4-year-old. And so we had absolutely no idea academically that there was any problem, because he's absolutely brilliant with both math and with language. However, that said, a lot of people who have CVI are not so lucky. And I actually have a very dear friend, and her daughter just discovered that she just discovered that her daughter has CVI this past school year at the age of 12. It's actually common for people who have CVI to go for years misdiagnosed. And so this happens all the time, and it's not unusual at all. And so when they discovered that her daughter had CVI, I think her daughter's vision is actually worse than my son's. And her daughter, this is a brilliant parent with a brilliant child who now, like Sebastian, is perfectly capable of describing her own functional vision now that she knows that her vision is different. So you have to understand, people who have CVI, when they're born with it, they have no way of knowing that their vision is different from everybody else's. And in fact, they assume that you see what they see. They assume.
Sorry to interrupt. I think that's the case with a lot of visual impairments, because I was born with a lazy eye, and the biggest question I get is, can you see properly? Well, I believe I can see properly because it's all I've known.
Yeah.
So I don't know if I can see properly or not, but.
Yeah, so you're like, sure.
Yeah, because you don't know, do you?
No, how are you supposed to know what everybody else can see if you've never seen it? They can't even imagine it. So to get back to my friend and her daughter, this is a brilliant mom. They homeschool, and she's an educator and brilliant. And she has tried every reading intervention under the sun for years, with tremendous, tremendous frustration for this child who just can't get it, just can't read, until they discovered this past school year, she has CVI, and they switched to Braille. And I believe it has been 4, maybe 5 months now of Braille. And this child is reading at grade level for the very first time.
Wow.
And she also has normal acuity, just like my son does, but the parts of her brain that recognize symbols, words, and letters and numbers are affected. And so it doesn't matter how many reading interventions she's had, she cannot recognize the words and letters and numbers, just like my son, even though he can draw faces with photographic realism, he cannot recognize them, right? So recognition is crucial to reading fluency. So anyway, so I just wanted to talk about that. So my son passed for typically sighted because he had visual access to numeracy and literacy, but also we have photos of my blind son making regular, consistent eye contact from his earliest days. He has no ability to recognize my face or anybody else's, and we have photo after photo of him making eye contact. And we have photos of him using something called visual guidance of reach at a developmentally appropriate age. And visual guidance of reach is where you look at an object and then you reach for it. And we have photos of him doing that. And so CVI can be an entirely invisible disability, which is really important for everybody to understand. If my blind son can be walking around appearing to be 100% typically sighted, anybody can be. Anybody can be. And in fact, there's research came out of the UK earlier this year showing that 1 in 30 students in a regular ed classroom have symptoms of CVI. 1 in 30, which makes it more prevalent than autism. Your question was about how did he not bump into furniture, right? So when we think about my baby who was making regular, consistent eye contact with me, even though he couldn't recognize my face, my son has something called affective blind sight, which means he has the ability to recognize facial expressions, even though he can't recognize faces themselves. And so he has always responded to facial expressions. He has always looked at faces. And even though he can't recognize faces and identify people the way that we do, he can still and always has recognized facial expressions. And the reason that's important is because so often people are told that their child can't have CVI because they make eye contact. Well, that's just wrong. You can absolutely be severely visually impaired and make regular, consistent eye contact. That is just a myth that children who have CVI all don't make eye contact. It's a myth. So I'm here to break that myth today. Any people who have CVI also have something called auditory processing disorder, which is CVI's auditory cousin. So they have normal, their ability to hear sound, it appears to be normal, but their ability to translate that sound into recognizable language can be affected severely. And so it is my opinion that CVI, one of the greatest tragedies of our time is the fact that we did not, as a community, a world community, recognize deaf blindness as a spectrum disorder.
Yeah.
The vast majority of people who are blind are not everything black. And the vast majority of people who are deaf are not everything gone. It's everything. All of our senses are processed in the brain, just like vision. Touch is processed in the brain, right? Hearing is processed in the brain, and brain damage affects that. And Sebastian actually has pretty severe auditory processing disorder, and he has actually no ability to see and hear at the same time. Actually, he can, it's just, he has almost no vision to begin with. So if you can imagine having almost no ability to see and then trying, the way he sees is by narrating the characteristics of stuff around him silently to himself. So if you could imagine trying to silently recite like a long poem to yourself, you know, something you've memorized in your head while you're listening to a lecture, like a physics lecture, you know, how much of the lecture are you going to get while you're reciting?
Exactly.
Yeah, right. So he can't do both well at the same time. And so it's actually really common for people who have CVI to have auditory processing disorder as well. So I would say it's common for kids who have CVI to not have that reflex that you're talking about. Although I would say people with ocular blindness, absolutely, they do that all the time, you know, and if they don't have any hearing issues. So I'm finally going to answer your question.
Yeah, sorry, yeah.
So on top of the affective blind sight, where my son is able to recognize facial expressions but not the faces themselves, my son has just regular blind sight. Blind sight is something we have known about, and CVI itself we've known about for 100 years. All of this is not new. They've been researching it since World War I, when the soldiers came back and had, you know, gunshot wounds to the head and lost vision because of it. And so we've known about blind sight, and blind sight is the ability to travel through space without vision, without full functioning vision, and to not bump into objects and things. This is not a new thing. We've known about it for a long time. And so you could put my son in a warehouse filled with all kinds of obstacles where he'd never been, and he could walk through the whole thing and he would never bump into anything, even though he can't actually see the objects technically. He says it's like he has like an alarm detector where he's aware that there's something in the way, and he doesn't necessarily know what that thing is. He just knows not to bump into it, even though he can't see it. So he was very, very gifted physically and was an athlete. Like I said, he was on the water polo team, he was on the dive team. His ability to see motion is really excellent. And for those listening who are going, oh my gosh, I just can't imagine any of this, I'll put a link for this as well. There's an excellent article on NPR, and it's called The Blind Woman Who Saw Rain. And it's the true story of how a woman had a stroke and she lost all of her sight except her ability to perceive motion. So she couldn't see light or color or anything else. It was all gone. And then one day she noticed she could see the rain coming down on the windows, the movement of the rain. And then when she was out walking with her daughter, she noticed that she could see the movement of her daughter's ponytail, but not the ponytail, just the movement, something swishing, you know? And so this is something that we know about. Different parts of the brain process different things. And in the back of that brain where the movement is processed, she still had that ability to see movement, even though she could not see light. She couldn't see color. And so my son has outstanding motion perception. And so the reason, yes, absolutely, moving furniture around in my house would cause him problems. You know, he'd have to relearn his steps, but he still wouldn't bump into things because he doesn't bump into things anyway because he has. So he got lucky that way.
So people seem to say CVI is caused by brain damage. Is it a condition that you're born with, or can it come on at any point? Like if you was to hit your head and have an accident and then damage the brain, could CVI come on? Or is it a combination of both?
Absolutely. That's such a great question. Yes, CVI can happen to anybody at any age, and it can happen to anybody from stroke, head injury, any type of lack of oxygen. So for example, drowning incidents, right? And if you survive the drowning, you could have lack of oxygen from that and have CVI as a result. So yeah, it can happen to anybody at any time. The reason it has become such an enormous public health crisis in developed nations especially is because our NICU care has increased exponentially in the last couple of decades. And we have all of these teeny tiny premature babies that did not used to survive, who now thankfully do, but they very often have brain bleeds, and they have epilepsy, and they have cerebral palsy, and many of them have CVI. And so we have this literally tens of thousands of people in the US alone who are struggling to gain access to diagnostic, educational, and habilitative services. And it's a nightmare, I will tell you. We had more than $150,000 in medical bills trying to get a diagnosis for my son. And I was using the correct medical terminology to describe my son's symptoms from the very first appointment after we discovered his CVI. I walked in, as soon as we discovered, the day we discovered that Sebastian was navigating by counting his steps and turns, it's like, oh my God, this is not okay, right? So the very next day during office hours, I called his neuropsychologist and made an appointment. And we went into that appointment using the correct medical terminology. And this doctor said, I can't help you, and I don't know anyone who can. Good luck with that. And we saw optometrists, we saw ophthalmologists, neuro-optometrists, neuro-ophthalmologists, neurologists, neuropsychologists, and we traveled across the country looking for anyone who could diagnose my son. And the only thing that my son needed, we knew that he needed a couple of weeks of orientation and mobility training with the white cane, because one of the very common symptoms of CVI is something called visual tiring. I don't know if you have ever fainted or been knocked out as a boxer. I've only fainted once. And when it happened, my vision went black. And then I passed out. I lost consciousness. But first, and I'll never forget it, the vision just went shoop, and it was black. And then I lost consciousness. So visual tiring is a function of blood pressure. And people who have CVI have much less neurological visual processing power to begin with than typically sighted people do. And so they're way more sensitive to changes and fluctuations in their blood pressure than typically sighted people are. So it affects their vision when their blood pressure changes. And so being overheated, exhausted, sick, overwhelmed, whatever it is, can actually and does frequently cause people who have CVI to have their already diminished vision, or to lose it entirely. And my son goes completely blind when he's overwhelmed and overheated. And we figured that out after we were walking for 3 miles on a 95-degree day. And all of a sudden, my son, who can read, he's a brilliant kid, and he couldn't read his phone anymore because he couldn't see the letters on his phone. And it was like, oh my gosh. And I'm like, so now we know not only is he almost completely blind, but sometimes he actually is completely blind. And this is common for people who have CVI. It's a common symptom of it. And then I knew he needed white cane training for emergencies, and so that's why we needed to get a diagnosis for him so badly. And we were labeled crazy by the medical establishment. And we were repeatedly verbally and emotionally abused. And I was actually physically threatened by a neuro-ophthalmologist that we had never even met, who walked into our appointment and without introducing himself, put his fist in my face and screamed at me saying, "Tell me how it's possible he can see words and letters and not faces. It's all the same channels." Well, it's not all the same channels. It just isn't. And they just aren't being taught the truth about how visual processing works. So we had a really rough time, and we ended up, fortunately, I had some amazing help. And I just have to thank Lucas Frank from the Seeing Eye Guide Dog organization. Lucas, in the days, I think it was only a few days after I discovered that Sebastian was navigating by counting his steps and turns. You have to understand, I knew nothing about blindness, nothing about CVI. I knew nothing at all about guide dogs. All I knew is that my kid was lost in this world, and it was devastating. And I was terrified for his safety. And I just thought, well, maybe a guide dog would help him. I don't know. I didn't know, so I called the Seeing Eye, and Pauline Surf Alexander answered the phone. And we had this, I'm sure, what she thought was a crazy conversation with this woman going, "My son's 15 and we just discovered that he's blind and no one knew," right? And she was so kind on the phone, and she asked me questions about how he figured it out and treated me like a totally normal person. And then we talked, she said, "Well, is he bumping into things?" And I was like, "No, he's never bumped into anything. That's how come we didn't realize there was anything wrong, And she said, "Well," and you have to understand, I knew nothing about guide dogs. And she said so kindly, she's like, "Probably a guide dog wouldn't be a good fit then, because that's what guide dogs do," right? And of course, I realized if I hadn't been so overwrought emotionally, I'm like, oh, I probably could have figured that out on my own, but I was just a mess. I was a mess. And so she was so kind. And I was like, "You're right. He doesn't bump into things, and he doesn't need help not bumping into things," right? So that's the guide dog's job. So I thought it was a nice conversation. I never expected to hear another thing from them. We hung up politely. And then I went on with, trying to, with our lives. And this was very early, just a few days after we discovered that he had CVI. And I had no idea it was going to be such a challenge to get a diagnosis for him, so I was very naive. So anyway, a few days later, the phone rang, and it was Lucas Frank from the Seeing Eye. And Pauline had passed this message on to him. And he talked to me for quite a while, asked questions about how we figured it out and how Sebastian was navigating. And then he spent quite a lot of time talking with Sebastian. And he asked Sebastian, "Well, how are you navigating and what are you doing?" And then after the conversation, he talked with me again, and he gave me some resources at the Chicago Lighthouse for the Blind and the name of different people to connect with there. And I was so touched, like, this is so nice. I just never expected anything like this from them, and I just was so touched. I never thought I'd hear from him again. And we ended the conversation, and I went ahead and contacted the Chicago Lighthouse. And then we, had this horrible battle to get a diagnosis for Sebastian, and it just kept getting worse and worse. And doctors were lying to us and hiding their own medical records from us and pretending that they didn't know us. And it was just awful. And a couple months had gone by, and I get a phone call from Lucas from the Seeing Eye, and he's like, "How you doing?"
He's like, "Thank you."
And he said, "I'm coming to Chicago for a conference. Would you like to have dinner?" And I was like, would I ever like to have dinner with you? And so we actually had dinner at one of our favorite local restaurants. And he did an informal orientation and mobility assessment on my son in the restaurant and out in the parking lot itself. And he could clearly tell, like I could, that navigating by counting your steps and turns is not typical. Right? That's not how typical people do it. And the fact was, he listened to my son and he believed him, right? Here's my kid who's a straight A honor student, who's never been in trouble of any kind, never been spanked, never had a detention, he's just a good kid, right? Like, why would you not believe him, right? So anyway, long story short, that was just very affirming. And it was through Lucas as things got worse and worse and worse, and we were labeled crazy. And we literally had doctors tell us that antidepressants would cure my son's brain damage, because of course it wasn't because he has actual vision impairment. It's because he's crazy, or, I shouldn't say crazy. I apologize for that. It's because he has, emotional disturbance and the crazy things. We had people tell us, very, very high quality medical professionals tell us that we should put my son on a bike in heavy traffic and enroll him in driver's ed, and that would cure his brain damage.
So, these are professional people.
These are professionals, yes. Yeah, so we had a royal battle. And so it was Lucas finally, after months. It took us six months before I even heard the words cerebral or cortical visual impairment. 6 months of doctor's appointment after doctor's appointment, nobody even telling me what this is called. And Lucas finally connected me with Jim Daramayak, who was the head of rehabilitation at the Johns Hopkins Eye Clinic. And Jim actually donated a class in CVI to me so that I could be a better advocate for my son. It was a $150 class on CVI, and I took the class, got an A. It was Memorial Day weekend in 2017. And on Tuesday morning after the holiday, I was emailing Jim going, okay, this is what's wrong with my son, listing this very long list of symptoms of CVI and everything that's wrong with him, using all the correct terminology. Now what do I do? And he gave me a couple of names in the Chicago area of doctors that maybe might be able to help us. And even with all of that, we still couldn't get a diagnosis from people here. And so that's when I was like, okay, I'm done. I'm going to just find the guy who taught the class on CVI. Well, his name is Professor Gordon Dutton, and he's in Scotland. And I found CVIScotland.org, and I sent them a very, very polite email saying, hey, my kid is on all the list of everything that's wrong. And I said, we really, really need help. And a couple of days later, I got a lovely message from Professor Dutton, very kind. And he actually connected us with Dr. Sylvie Chakran, who is the director of the Unit of Vision and Cognition at La Fondation Rothschild in Paris, France. And he helped supervise a research study on Sebastian. And so we flew to Paris for a week, and Dr. Chakran did a whole week-long research study just on Sebastian. And what was important about this research study is one of the reasons we had difficulty getting a diagnosis for my son CVI was because he has what is a normal appearing MRI. So an MRI is a brain scan, right? And it only shows the structure of your brain. It does not show the function. And so approximately 10% of people who have cerebral palsy have normal appearing MRI, and yet they still have cerebral palsy. And it's believed that the numbers are about the same for people who have CVI. So my son had a normal appearing MRI, and we were repeatedly told it was impossible for him to have any kind of neurological visual impairment with a normal MRI. Well, that is also a myth. It's just a myth. You can totally have a normal appearing MRI. A lot of damage to the brain can be microscopic and still have significant impact. So anyway, what was important about going to Paris is Dr. Chakran did something called a SPECT scan on Sebastian. A SPECT scan is a nuclear medicine test, and it measures blood flow to the brain. And any areas of the brain that are not receiving blood flow are dead tissue. And Dr. Chakran found significant brain damage in the right fusiform gyrus of the brain and other places, throughout the brain. Sebastian did have significant brain damage because I almost died giving birth to him. Wow. And so he was not a preemie. He was born full term, but 3 days before my due date, I was diagnosed with preeclampsia. And so I went to the hospital and I was induced. And of course, when you're induced, sorry, my brain just died there. So anyway, long story short, I had an epidural, and I coded from the epidural. I was a code blue, and my blood pressure dropped to 40/26. And according to my husband, who was present for the whole time, there was no fetal distress. There was a fetal monitor. And so I did not have an emergency C-section. I was unconscious for about 6 hours of my labor. And when I woke up, I was paralyzed from the chest down, and the nurse was pressing on my stomach saying, "Do you feel a contraction?" And I was like, "I can't feel anything." And a couple hours after that, I had a typical birth. And my son, they told us he had a 9 on his APGAR, which is excellent. And we took him home from the hospital believing we had a perfectly healthy baby. And I will tell you, I am an early childhood music and movement specialist. Sebastian received intensive music and movement from his birth, because that's what I do. And I think it's fun. I had no idea there was anything wrong with him because we were told he was fine. However, there are more than 2 decades of research demonstrating that music and movement, high quality music and movement experiences before the age of 7 have tremendous neurological benefits, including better balance, coordination, fine and gross motor skills, proprioception, which is knowledge of where your body is in space, which comes in handy when you can't see your own body, right? Also, auditory discrimination, language development, reading and math ability, and IQ. 2 decades of research demonstrating the connection between all of these neurological benefits and music and movement in early childhood. And so my blind son, who has no ability to recognize faces, places, objects, biological forms, nothing, had all normal developmental milestones, and took the training wheels off his bike when he was 4 and has been riding around our neighborhood ever since. And we had literally no idea that there was anything wrong. And so CVI can be an entirely invisible disability. And the vast majority of children who have CVI are severely developmentally delayed. I am here today to tell you that that doesn't have to happen. There is so much that parents can do to intervene with music and movement, and it needs to be the greatest neuroplasticity in the brain happens between birth and age 3, because that's when the brain is still growing in size. So it is so important to be singing to your child. It is so important. They need lullabies. They need to hear the sound of their own parents' voices, not just recordings of other people. There is nothing more calming to an infant or toddler than the sound of their own parent's voice. And they need to feel when you lay them on your chest here and you hold them and you're singing and rocking, they need to feel the movement. And they need that so that they can develop a normal proprioceptive system. Our ears have 2 functions. They have the hearing listening function, and there's also the balance vestibular function. They don't just hear. And so in order to have a normal vestibular function in a child, they must experience movement. And when you combine it with music, it is just magical. It is just amazing what can happen. And we are just awash today in children who have sensory processing disorder, because we have all of these children buckled into car seats and buckled into strollers and buckled into things that prevent them from moving. Children need the sensory stimulation of movement to develop normal neurological systems.
100% agree with that. Going on to around the time you found out stuff, for you, as a parent, did you ever blame yourself for one, Sebastian ending up with the condition, and for 2, you not picking up on it? Was there ever a point where you blamed yourself?
Oh my gosh, it was horrible. It was absolutely horrible. And I'll tell you, although my son's version of CVI is an entirely invisible disability, there were little cute clues, like tiny, mysterious clues that there was something off. And I'll tell you, my son was repeatedly misdiagnosed, but the clues were so subtle. So for example, when the first thing I can think of that was a little odd was when he was about 2.5, 3 years old, he started to play something that he called the I'm nervous game. That was his name for it. And when we were going to the grocery store or to gymnastic class in the car, he'd say, "I'm nervous, Mom, I'm nervous." And I was like, "Well, why are you nervous? We're just going to the grocery store, And he would just say, "I don't know. I'm just nervous. I'm nervous." And so it is fear of going to visually complex, crowded places is a common symptom of CVI. Because if you imagine when you go to the grocery store and you see the shelves, it's like, where's Waldo, right? Where's the cereal box? Where's the mac and cheese? It's just so visually overwhelming. And so that was very odd because I'm like, well, why is he nervous? And when I brought it to the attention of his doctor, I was told, well, he's just seeking negative attention, just distract him with something else. My son never had tantrums. He was not melting down about it. He literally named it a game. That wasn't my word. So I just distracted him with other stuff. And eventually he stopped telling me that, but it was odd. That was odd. And then when he went into preschool at the age of 3, my son cried every day at drop-off for 2 solid years of preschool and then frequently in kindergarten as well, even though he has a fall birthday and was one of the older children in the class. He was emotionally mature. He had his best friends in the same class with him. He loved his teacher. He was very academically successful, already reading and writing at the age of 2.5. He loved the toys. It made absolutely no sense why this crying at drop off. And when I asked his teachers and his doctors, they were just like, oh, some kids just do this, don't worry about it. We worry about the ones who can't settle down. Well, my son always settled down quickly. And so what we know now is that it is absolutely terrifying to be blind and have no one around you know that you're blind, not be able to recognize your teachers and your classmates and your surroundings and know where the bathroom is in relationship to your classroom or where the sink is or where your seat is, to not have any of that information that everybody else around you assumes that you can do because you look like you're fine. It is terrifying. And my son, I'll tell you, I know several adults and teenagers who have CVI that didn't get diagnosed. One of them was 26 and is legally blind and didn't get diagnosed. She's 30 something now, but was 26 when she was diagnosed because it happens all the time. All of them suffer serious trauma from going undiagnosed for so long and not getting orientation and mobility training services because it is so terrifying to be blind and have everybody else around you not know that and not help you.
It's an amazing thing you do because in our short conversation, there's so many things I weren't aware about. And I think you're just getting a really good message out to everyone because of how common you're saying it actually is. And it just proves that the medical profession needs to take note and take time to actually work it out so they can help people out at an early stage.
Absolutely.
Because it's just, I feel really sorry for everything you had to go through. But in a way, if you didn't go through that, you wouldn't be here today being able to advocate for this. And
I will tell you, I would not wish what happened to us on any human being in the world. It's such a vibrant, rich community of people. And I just feel like it's amazing, and so I appreciate that very much. And I also just wanted to say that things have changed considerably since 2017 when this first happened to us.
So one last question before we go, and this is the question I ask every guest. If you had 30 seconds with your 13-year-old self, what would you say?
Your kid's going to be blind.
Stephanie, thank you so much for joining us. I feel like we could have gone on for hours because you've just opened my eyes up to a lot of things I never even knew about. So thank you so much for your time and good luck with everything. And I'd love to have you come back in a couple of months and catch up. And
thank you for having me here today for this opportunity to bring awareness.